Hello, my name is Harold Halfdan and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft. Thought it would be fun to combine the two. Last time on Archaeological Minecraft, I started constructing a Roman aqueduct and talked all about how the Romans determined what made up a good source of water for an aqueduct and what materials they built those aqueducts out of. I also talked a bit about the different kinds of pipes they used in aqueducts, like masonry, ceramic, lead, bronze, and even sometimes stone and wooden piping. I also talked about how sometimes they would decide to span gaps using an inverse siphon instead of building a bridge. If you want to learn more about those subjects, I recommend you watch part 1, but in this episode, I finish up my recreation of the Roman aqueduct in Minecraft, and we focus on the different parts of the aqueduct and finish building the bridge to span the gap between the aqueduct's source in the snowy mountains near Canadian Dragon's base across this steep river gorge over to my island base. I mentioned this last week, but it's worth revisiting, that I'm building this structure on the Archaeo SMP, which is a survival Minecraft server run by Archaeoplays. I'm a member of the server, and it also has a number of other archaeologists and history and archaeology enthusiasts as members. I'm going to put links in the description to my server mates that also create content on the server, and will encourage you to go check out their YouTube channels if you like my content. Okay, with that intro and background out of the way, let's start with a tour of the structure. It all started with the source, and up near that source, the aqueduct would start by creating a cistern, or in other words, a collection pool for storing the spring water. These collection pools varied in size and shape. Some were rectangular and others even were octagonal, but it really depended based on the specific source and the specific needs of the collection pool. As you imagine, they were designed to store the water and help maintain a good and consistent supply. Note that these holding areas, the water is not flowing out of the bottom nor the top of the cistern. The Romans understood that sediment and other impurities would sink down to the bottom of the collection pool, and other impurities would float on the surface. As such, the water was pulled from the middle of the pool to help reduce sending those impurities and sediments downstream, thus promoting a healthier source of drinking water. The next element of the aqueduct was the channel and pipes. I already talked at some length about these, so I won't belabor this element too much longer. However, I do want to point out that for most of the route of the aqueduct's course, these channels or pipes were underground, dug into channels carved into the ground around a meter or so deep. In at least one aqueduct, this path was marked with marker stones on the surface called Gică, which allowed workers doing maintenance to more easily find the route of where this underground path went. These were placed around 240 Roman feet, or around 71 meters apart from one another. The channels, as I mentioned, were wide enough and tall enough for a man to be able to maneuver through them to do future maintenance, and they were lined halfway up with smoothed and polished concrete. Roman concrete is a miracle material and was stronger than modern concrete. It would harden underwater and got stronger with age and possess a self-healing property. This was because, unlike modern concrete, when micro cracks would form in the Roman concrete, it would develop deposits and inclusions that would fill those micro cracks, where with modern concrete, it doesn't do that. So when water starts to permeate, it further separates and breaks apart the concrete, thus weakening it. Channels were either vaulted or covered over with stone slabs that could be later removed to allow workers through. Shafts were also dug from the surface down to the channels to allow workers to access it or do inspections. Romans also thought about the fact that particulates and impurities needed to be removed at times throughout the route, and so drop shafts were used, as well as a structure called a Băeştean, which were basically like small settling tanks, similar to what we described before with the collection pool, but located along the route. The drop shafts allowed the water to be aerated, which kept it from becoming stagnant and allowed impurities to sink to the bottom, and then the settling tanks allowed the water to flow slower, which then allowed the impurities to float to the surface, which then allowed pure water in the middle of the channel to continue along its route. Bridges were an important element of the aqueduct's construction because they allowed the channel and water to span gaps in the terrain, though, as I mentioned, over 80% of the aqueduct's course was through underground channels. The Romans understood how to support a structure by use of archways, even if they didn't understand the underlying physics behind how they worked. They knew exactly what was needed for them to be built and their structural limits from a practical perspective. As such, when building a bridge, the Romans were mindful to limit the height of the arches to around 20 to 21 meters high, and the taller the arch, the narrower it was. This helped limit the amount of forces and weight the structure would have to support. They were also mindful of the side-to-side force or shear that the bridge would have to withstand, and so pillars were generally pretty massive. If a span of arches had to be higher than 20 meters, the bridge would have multiple layers of arches. Sometimes for especially high spans, they might even have 3 layers of arches. If it made sense to, certainly when getting close to their destination city, several channels from different aqueducts could be combined together to leverage the same bridge to pass across a span. So you'd maybe have multiple aqueducts that would feed from different sources, but then all coalesce into one bridge channel, which would then come across, thus not having to build multiple bridges. In this example, I brought the main channel over the top of the bridge, but then I also brought a siphon connection down lower in the slope across the river on the lower part of the bridge, and then back up on the other side. So you can see an example of how maybe a siphon came across, as well as how a bridge channel would come across. In this example, I made sure when I did the siphon path that the siphon was lower on the far side than on the near side, as I talked about before. When a channel had to go around a hill, something called a substructio was created. This is basically a low, broad wall that would be built along the hill to allow the channel to follow the contour line as well as maintain the proper slope and water flow. All that said, these were not preferred and were avoided where possible, as they were expensive and labor-intensive to build and vulnerable to damage or sabotage, but were at times unavoidable. I didn't end up building one of these in my aqueduct recreation, as it didn't fit what was needed in the landscape, but wanted to mention it all the same. Once an aqueduct reached its destination like a city, the water was channeled into a series of tanks called a castellum. These were essentially 3 main holding tanks that were laid out in a very ingenious and telling way. The first tank was the lowest and was the largest tank, where the water was allowed to settle, as I described previously, so that impurities could either float or sink to the bottom. From this first tank, connections were sent out to the public, such as for fountains or for public pools. Basically, these were the sources of water for the vast majority of the citizens who didn't have direct connections to water supplies directly to their homes. Also from this main lower supply tank was a secondary tank located a bit higher up. The connection between these 2 tanks contained various filters, such as running water through sandbags to further remove impurities. From this secondary tank went all the connections out to the baths and for water used for businesses. This water was taxed by the Roman government. From this second tank was a connection to an even higher tank, which again had additional filters for running the water through to remove even more impurities. This third supply tank were all the connections out to all the private homes and gardens, and these connections were also taxed just like the connections out from the second tank. Because of this design, it meant that in times of drought or low water supply, the first water supply that would run out would be the one to the private homes, followed by the ones for the businesses and then the baths, and then only at the very end of the drought would water run out to the general public and the fountains. It also meant that because of the additional purification and filters, the water that went out to the people being taxed for their water supply would get a higher quality water source and thus get value for their money and reduce the chance of rich Romans trying to divert or make connections to the poor quality water supply, as that water didn't go through those additional filtering processes. While I've spent what's now 2 episodes building and talking about these Roman aqueducts, it's important to note that the Romans were not the only people to build aqueducts, and that aqueducts were also built by the Greeks, the Carthaginians, as well as other ancient civilizations such as the Persians, Assyrians, Egyptians, and many more. Their use also didn't cease with the end of the Roman era either, but that some of the Roman aqueducts continued to be used throughout the Middle Ages, and in fact, some continued to be used up until modern day, or sometimes even when they were abandoned, were repaired and then used until quite recently. In fact, one of the Roman aqueducts in Rome, called the Aquia Virgo, is still used in Rome today, and if you have ever been to Rome and seen the Trevi Fountain, yep, you guessed it, that's where that water comes from. Well, that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed my recreation of a Roman aqueduct. As always, I put some resources I uncovered while doing my research for this video in the description, so you can check those out if you want to learn more. If you want to check out some of the other videos I've made about other Roman structures, you can find them by clicking on the links here or maybe over here. Well, that's it. Thanks. Like, subscribe, and all that. Have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.